Last week, we examined the cost of being needed as Taiwan's role across the Indo-Pacific expands. Partnerships multiply, but so do domestic strains. We took a look at infrastructure, energy, and workforce pressure, and we asked whether outward responsibility is beginning to outpace inward capacity. And this week, we widen our lens because before we talk about what Taiwan should do, we need to be clear about the strategic environment it's operating in. And that environment is increasingly defined by the relationship between the United States and China. Right now, as we speak, Washington's message on Taiwan is not a single signal, but a pattern. On one hand, U.S. defense assessments continue to warn about China's growing military capabilities and the possibility that Beijing could be ready to prevail in a conflict against Taiwan by 2027. At the same time, those same assessments increasingly emphasize coercion below the threshold of full-scale war, pressure designed to force outcomes without triggering a catastrophe between Taiwan and China. But then there's policy. The United States has just locked in another round of support through the National Defense Authorization Act, institutionalizing funding, training, logistics, and long-term planning for Taiwan's defense. That seems like real commitment, but it's also carefully worded, preserving flexibility for the White House as it manages a far larger U.S.-China relationship, especially now that we know that President Trump and Xi Jinping are likely to meet 4 times in the year 2024. Taken together, these signals point to a reality that Taiwan sits inside a framework of managed competition. Deterrence matters, yes. Support matters, yes. But so do restraint, signaling, and strategic optionality. Now, this episode starts with that constraint, because once you accept that Taiwan's future is being shaped by how Washington and Beijing manage their rivalry or partnership, the question changes. It's no longer just about alignment, it's about how Taiwan builds strength, resilience, and leverage within limits that it does not control. Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Reefs, a show produced by Radio Taiwan International. Here we talk about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation. Let's start with a series of our news stories today here on RTI. So on paper, the U.S. just reinforced its commitment to Taiwan. President Donald Trump has signed the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, authorizing up to $1 billion for Taiwan security cooperation. And the law expands training, logistics, medical preparedness, Coast Guard cooperation, and unmanned systems development. It also calls for a long-term Taiwan security assistance to roadmap and explores a regional contingency stockpile. But alongside the signature came a reminder that Trump emphasized that certain provisions would be implemented in a way that preserves presidential authority over foreign and military affairs, a signal that these support, they come with boundaries. Now, at first glance, it looks reassuring. Money is allocated, training is expanded, planning is institutionalized, but this isn't symbolic support, it's bureaucratic, budgeted, and supposedly written into law. But this is where the signals get a little bit complicated. Sometimes what matters most is not what's funded, but how it carefully is framed. Trump didn't reject the bill, he signed it, but he also went out of his way to underline executive discretion. That's not a throwaway line. It's a reminder that Taiwan policy still sits inside a much larger U.S.-China equation. So the message is layered. The U.S. wants Taiwan to be more capable, yes, more resilient, yes, harder to pressure, but also wants room to maneuver, to calibrate, delay, adjust, de-escalate if the broader strategic environment shifts. Take, for example, Japan, who recently got into a little spat with China and turned around to see that the U.S. no longer is backing it 100%. So for Taiwan, this is the first constraint. Support exists, but it is structured, conditional, and never automatic. Our second story is about the U.S. Department of War. Reporting suggests that China's most decisive path towards unification with Taiwan may not be full-scale war, but coercion below that threshold, which, if you're Taiwanese, you more or less already guessed that. The report says the PLA has rehearsed scenarios including cyber attacks, electronic warfare, simulated port blockades, and limited strikes designed to undermine confidence and force negotiations. These actions would be combined with economic, diplomatic, and informational pressure. While less costly than invasion, the report notes such coercive strategies would rely heavily on Taiwan's ability or inability to resist sustained pressure without breaking. This is where the tone noticeably shifts. If you've been listening carefully, this isn't the language of imminent invasion. It's the language of pressure management. This is not as fear-mongering, but as strategic realism. Full-scale war is expensive, it's unpredictable, and once it starts, nobody controls the outcome. Coercion, on the other hand, lets Beijing apply force while still keeping the door open to negotiation. And there's a second layer here, one that's, uncomfortable for Taiwan. Coercion only works if a society fractures, if confidence erodes, if people stop believing the system will hold. And guess what? Taiwan's constitution is currently going through a crisis. The president is likely going to face impeachment. So when U.S. assessments focus on coercion rather than invasion, they're quietly shifting the burden. The decisive variable isn't whether Taiwan can win a war, it's whether Taiwan can stay calm, functional, and cohesive while being tested over time. And that's a very different kind of battlefield. It's one that can't be solved by weapons alone. But that's also not saying that China doesn't have the physical capabilities to take Taiwan. A draft Pentagon report says China expects to be able to fight and win a war against Taiwan by the end of 2027. The report cites rapid military modernization, long-range strike capabilities that could challenge U.S. forces far from China's shores, and a growing nuclear arsenal projected to exceed 1,000 warheads by 2030. While the report does not predict war, it highlights the pace and scale of China's buildup, framing 2027 as a key capability benchmark for U.S. planners. Now, I would say that deadline is probably much sooner, especially given that China's latest aircraft carrier, the Fujian, seems to have completed most of its testing and is now trying to finalize some of the key aspects of being able to operate at full functionalities.
We've heard the word nuclear come up a lot in the Asia-Pacific region this year, and now there's a Reuters report pointing to a growing stockpile of Chinese nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles. China's arsenal is growing faster than that of any other nuclear power. A recent report cited by Reuters says that the country has placed 100 ICBMs into silos close to the Mongolian border. Although that is deep inland, some missiles have ranges exceeding 15,000 kilometers, meaning they can strike targets in the continental US, let alone in the Indo-Pacific.
China's rise in their missile capabilities and the expansion of their rocket force has definitely been a focus of the overall global observation of China's military modernization. It comes at a time when the People's Liberation Army continues its very aggressive military operations, and at the same time, the commitment and credibility of U.S. defense commitment to its allies across the region has also been put to question.
Although the report did not mention any targets, it does indicate that China's arsenal, which stood at about 600 warheads last year, could nearly double to 1,000 by 2030. That's amid concerns that Chinese President Xi Jinping could move to invade Taiwan in 2027. There's a growing risk of nuclear proliferation across the Indo-Pacific. A recent report quoted a Japanese lawmaker saying the country should consider its own nuclear weapons. North Korea continues building up its nuclear program despite sanctions, and US President Donald Trump said he would be interested in restarting nuclear testing, although no details have been announced. As China continues building up its nuclear arsenal, and other countries consider doing the same, this could represent a huge shift in Asia's security situation.
Now, this is the part that makes people uneasy, and for good reason, because now the signals don't line up neatly. On one side, the US appears more relaxed in tone, more focused on managing risk, more willing to believe conflict can be avoided, delayed, or shaped through pressure and deterrence. But on the other hand, China's capability curve doesn't slow down just because Washington's language does. Capability is not intent, but it shapes options. A China that can fight by 2027 doesn't have to choose to, but it does gain leverage, and leverage changes how coercion feels on the receiving end. It also changes what is put on the negotiation table with the US. For Taiwan, this creates the core anxiety of the moment. If the US believes competition can be stabilized, but China continues to build ability to force outcomes, Taiwan ends up living in the gap between those two beliefs. And that gap doesn't automatically mean war, but does mean pressure, sustained, calibrated, and difficult to escape. And that's the reality that Taiwan has to plan for, whether it likes it or not. So if that's the outer constraint, the United States trying to manage risk and China building leverage and Taiwan sitting in between, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What do you do when the biggest player in the room is still present, still says it's supportive, but less willing to carry everything on its own? Well, that's where this episode turns, because Taiwan isn't the only one reading these signals. Japan is reading them too. And both are starting to behave like countries that know the umbrella is still there, but thinner, and that it's time to look sideways, not just upwards. President Lai Ching-te has called for formalizing Taiwan's whole of society defense, resilience through law and institutional framework. At a recent presidential office meeting, Lai urged clearer authorization mechanisms, cross-ministerial coordination, and deeper civilian participation in resilience planning. Now, this is where Taiwan starts adjusting, quietly but decisively. And this move isn't just about militarizing society, it's about acknowledging reality. If coercion below war is the likely pressure point, then resilience becomes the first line of defense. And notice the shift in language. This isn't just be prepared, it's legalization, authorization, division of labor. In other words, turning resilience from a concept or a slogan into a system. That tells you something important. Taiwan is no longer assuming that crises will be short, external, or purely military. There's also an unspoken admission here. If outside support is conditional and calibrated, then Taiwan has to be able to hold itself together socially, economically, psychologically, long enough for any help to matter. And President Lai also recently met with visiting Japanese lawmakers, including senior figures from the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, calling for a deeper Taiwan-Japan cooperation at what he described as critical moment. Former Japanese Justice Minister Keisuke Suzuki said an incident in Taiwan would be an incident for Japan and stressed opposition to any attempt to change the status quo by force. Lai highlighted shared geographic risk along the First Island chain and the need for closer security and economic cooperation. Now, this, along with the Japanese Prime Minister's comment a few weeks ago at the Diet, is the country speaking more plainly than before, that timing matters. It isn't just about Japan becoming more hawkish, it's about Japan becoming more self-aware. Tokyo is also sensing that U.S. guarantees are no longer automatic or cost-free. Support might still be there, but it now comes with expectations of regional burden sharing. And that's why statements like an incident in Taiwan is an incident for Japan isn't just solidarity, it's positioning. Japan is signaling that its own security is directly tied to Taiwan's stability, whether Washington likes it or not. And this is where Taiwan and Japan start to look like countries on the same boat. Neither controls U.S.-China relations, and both understanding that waiting passively is no longer an option. So they're doing what defensive realism predicts, tightening horizontal ties, quiet coordination, shared framing, making it harder for coercion against one to stay isolated. It's not an alliance announcement, it's something subtler, and in this environment, possibly more durable.
Lawmakers from Japan speak to the media as they finish up a visit to Taiwan, where they met with senior officials and discussed how to work together more closely.
During our visit to Taiwan, we met with Taiwan President Lai Ching-te, Taiwan Vice President Bi Kim-hsiao, and Taipei Mayor Zhang Wan-an to exchange views on strengthening Taiwan-Japan relations. We don't want anything to happen to Taiwan, so we need to increase deterrence.
The lawmakers told officials that if Taiwan is safe, then Japan and the region are safe. They say maintaining good relations between Japan and Taiwan is crucial to regional peace. And they hope to cooperate more in areas like trade and economic security. Apart from this group, 2 other Japanese delegations also visited Taiwan this week, meeting with President Lai Ching-te and other high-level officials. And they're just some of around 30 lawmakers that are expected to come over the next few months. The visits come amid heightened tensions between Tokyo and Beijing, after Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai said Japan could respond militarily if China attacked Taiwan. China claims Taiwan and threatens to use force to take it. But such visits aren't new. Japanese lawmakers often travel to Taiwan, and at least one delegation says their trip was planned months ago, before the spat with China. But at least one analyst says the recent spat with China could account for the large number of lawmakers coming around the same time. Regardless of why they came, China has made its disapproval clear. On Tuesday, Beijing slammed the visit of one high-level lawmaker, saying Japan should not interfere in its internal affairs. And with more trips like these expected in the coming months, things are not likely to cool off anytime soon.
So looking ahead, the signals from Washington are mixed, but they're not random. On one hand, the U.S. is allowing NVIDIA, for example, to move ahead with plans to ship its H200 AI chips to China, assuming approval coming through. That tells you decoupling isn't total. There's still room for managed trade. At the same time, Washington is laying the groundwork for new tariffs on Chinese semiconductor imports starting in 2027, but delaying it, even though this is explicitly pointing to concerns about China's industrial strategy and economic reach.
The Trump administration has delayed new tariffs on Chinese semiconductors to the US until June 2027. The US Trade Representative describes China's attempt to dominate the chip market as unreasonable, but has set the new tariff rate to 0%. Any further duties would stack on top of the existing 50% tariff on Chinese chips. Most Chinese imports in the US are so-called mature chips, older tech used in everything from cars to dishwashers. The delay could signal a thaw in the US-China trade war, as the White House also recently authorized the sale of NVIDIA's second most advanced AI chip, the H200, to Beijing. The US and China are still negotiating a trade deal, with US President Donald Trump due to visit Beijing in April.
So even as some doors stay open, others are clearly still being reinforced. The caution is still there, the wariness hasn't gone away, but you can see there is a shift in tone. Once again, I'd like to remind you that 2026 is when the U.S. is going to celebrate its 250th year. Trump is going to meet with Xi Jinping. President Trump is going to meet with President Xi Jinping, they say 4 times next year. Obviously, he has to lay some groundwork for this diplomatic sessions to happen. And in the middle of all of this, one thing feels settled. Chips and AI are where the future is being shaped. That's still where growth is. That's still where leverage and influence are converging. Taiwan understands that. With the passage of its AI Basic Act, it's not just chasing speed or scale. It's starting to build rules, guardrails, and long-term credibility around AI in a world where signals keep shifting. That kind of groundwork may matter more than any single policy move. And that wraps up some of the key socioeconomic stories from Taiwan this week. To keep track of how this island's choices ripple far beyond its shores, let's go beyond the reefs again next week here on Radio Taiwan International. I'm Joey Chow. Catch you next week.